Hello and welcome to the podcast. It's so good to have you here. And as you know, if you've been listening, I'm doing a short series on The Brightness of Stars, which is the third edition of the book coming out in May 2022. And why am I doing this? Because I want to introduce to you some of the people who are taking part in that book. So just to remind you, so I wrote that book about 10 years ago. I had no publisher. It was very different times. We didn't have social media. We weren't sharing all of our things. I didn't know anybody with experience like me. And I was really keen to pull together something where people who had experiences like I did, who were just getting on in their lives and were just living their life, I wanted to speak to those people. And so that's why I wrote the book. And it turned out to be a really therapeutic experience. Now we're in 2022 and Routledge are going to be publishing a third edition, which is really exciting. And the third edition is quite different than the first edition. So we have now 3 sections. So we have the section at the beginning where I share my story and my reflections on my story. In this part 2, we have the original contributors who also reflect upon their original story. And then in part 3, we have new people sharing in their own authentic way, in their own words, in the moment of time that they are in, whatever it is that they want to share. And it is today I'm with somebody who is in that particular section, and that's Sean. So welcome, Sean, and thank you so much for popping onto the podcast today.
Pleasure, Lisa.
It's so good to have you here. And now it's really interesting because I'm speaking to people across every decade. And I spoke to our youngest contributor earlier, and I think she's about 23, 24. And I'm not going to place an age on you, but I would say you are one of the older contributors. And so we have this exciting kind of series of stories across the decades, across all the different policies, across all the different legislations, across all the different acts that relate to children. And there's something really fascinating about that for me. So I'm really interested, Sean. What was it about being involved in the Brightness of Stars that drew you in and that made you want to be a part of this project?
Well, I think you've just touched on it, really. I mean, it was genuinely an honour for you to ask me, actually. I mean, I've been very involved at Shauna's age, actually, at 23, in the fledgling policy stuff around being in care, and had been part of setting up a national organisation. And I hadn't realised until recently how important that organisation was, and the work that I'd done in that organisation in establishing the first policies that ever came out of the care experience community. We didn't call it the community then. It was the National Association of Young People in Care. That was the focus. But we were driven by changes that needed to be happening in the care system. We were encouraged by, at the time, the Black civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s, gay rights, the women's organisations, disability groups, and children's rights sort of seemed to be, you know, the next logical step, and it was, because shortly after the work that we did, and apparently we were trailblazers, and that's encouraging to hear. We had the UN Convention on Children's Rights, which came out in '89, which is becoming very, very important today. So that was my history. I mean, I'd left much of that behind me. And to answer your question, what drew me back was this sense of community that is expressed in this book. And I first really noticed on Twitter, and I think you were very early in reaching out to me, and we just connected. And that's what happens with people from care experience backgrounds. You know, we kind of connect. um, and we kind of know, and that at my age now becomes important to me, because I see the sweep of my life, and I see, and I'm concerned, by the way, about the changes to children's rights and the work that we did back in the day. So I felt I needed to say something as well. I felt I needed to make it clear to our own community that we have this history. I was part of that, and it seems to have been swept away. And my initial talks with you were very much about why that happened and what we can do about that. That's my cat, by the way. And I am doing something about that with many of the people that are in this book, actually. We do hope to make those changes and bring about a sense of community on a national level. On a personal level, which is where I found myself being guided, gently guided by you, I did have to open up about my own personal history, which I was reluctant to do.
And I think that is what's so humbling for me, is that people trust me. I think because of our shared experience, a very particular experience that's often very misunderstood, to hold stories and honor them and ensure that there is an opportunity for authenticity that is not played around with, manipulated, moved about, but that there is an opportunity to just show up with where you are at that time. Because one of the things that's really been interesting to me about the book is how much it's not expected. I don't think it's understood that we change over time. So we change the way we view those experiences over time based on the things that happen to us that alter the way we see things. And I know when I first wrote the book, the exposing element for me was that people felt that they knew everything about me. There was almost like that misunderstanding that you're sharing a particular part of yourself as you understand it in that moment, and that it is subject to change. It's like a piece of art. Once it's there, but actually any artist could go back and change it and update it and put different colors in. And I think what I was really interested with in terms of asking you to take part was around that understanding that people might not have, that there is a history, and there's a history of involvement from care experienced people in terms of how that has changed and shaped the discourse, along with very persistent researchers, that has added to better legislation and what should create more improved services. And I think we have seen improvements. I'm not sure everyone would agree with me, but I think we have. When I talk to people from every decade, I know we've had improvements. The things that really trouble young people now, some of them are the same, but we don't have those huge historical abuse stories in the same way that we had in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
No, and excuse me. No, we don't, but there are different kinds of abuses that are still happening today.
Yeah.
And there are abuses that are happening in separated families. I think there are huge abuses that in the future we'll look back on this period and go, well, you know, that was an abuse of a children's right to be happy and find fulfillment. And I think that's the key to this. You know, it is a children's rights for me. It's very much a children's rights issue. Still, I believe. I mean, I was shocked when a very young person wrote to me, direct message about some videos that I made. I was also I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. I made the very first care videos. So I made Blacking in Care, Speak Out. These were the very first voices on video ever for young people in the care system. And I wasn't as well, I didn't have the ability really at that age to be able to deal with these kinds of heavy stories. But I was also very concerned at the time that, you see, in our community, story has always been used against people. And our past and what people think of about us in our files and so on has always been a way to reinterpret what we say. And that was very much the case back in my day. So it was very important at that time for people to be very clear about the changes they wanted to see. So in Blackening in Care, we see this wonderful poetry and music and creativity within the care community. And we see people being very clear about what their stories mean, about their experiences and what they mean. And it's having that ownership of story that's important, I think. I was really concerned when I got this DM from a young woman who said, having watched those videos, nothing has changed. And I thought, well, how can you say that nothing has changed? And after all the work that we did, the 89 Act, our community in NAPIC was critical in shaping the 1989 Children's Act. I want people to know that. We were the first policy makers. All of the current policies came from our community. We created them. I wrote them down in a report called Sharing Care and went to Parliament. It's important that people understand that we still hold that ability to make those positive changes. Where we see people who are not happy and where we see abuses happening, it is really up to us, I think now, which is why I'm so involved in this, to be able to support the changes that need to happen. And I also see beyond that, and I don't see that happening in any of the reviews at the moment or any of the policy work, I'm sorry to say, but I also see this as a civil rights issue more than ever now. I actually think that we do need protected characteristics as a community. I think that we should be looking at how we get our community invested in its people, its resources, in exactly the same way and with exactly the same arguments around, other communities that have been, devastated in the way that we have. We need to be brought together. We need to be invested in. We need a central figurehead. We need a better understanding from the public around stigma. And what I'd like to think is that these stories, and why people like yourself and I need to step up, is we need to show them a different face to the care experience. We need to show people that we're, that we have our, we are a, multifaceted group of people. Some very high experienced professionals who've written, in your book. People who've got to the top of their profession. We need to, psychiatrists, we've got global advocates, we've got incredible resource within our community. And then we've got to get to the point where people stop, and I've learned this from young people, we've got to get to the point where we stop allowing other people to do what we need to do. Nothing about us without us. It absolutely exemplifies the care experience to me. So I see this as a really current issue, and I think our history is part of that. In terms of the personal story that I had shared with you, it became, when one shares a personal story, especially with, and one is much more inclined to do that with another care experience person. So you're absolutely right. I mean, that is key to any review or any other policy group. And that's what, they're all getting wrong. You've got to have people in there that people will talk to, so that you really get the gold, and I think, the treasure that people can offer you, because that's what it is. So you've got to have people in place who can do that. You've got to have people who represent those views as well. But ultimately, those stories are a gift really to people. They're an asset, and people should look at those and go, what can I, how do I feel about this? What can I learn about this? In my own case, discussing the domestic abuse that happened with my own family was a very painful experience for me. Probably as painful or worse than growing up in the care system, because it involved my children. And to talk about that with you was not something I wanted to do. But I have been active around that, and I have made some personal changes to policy nationally and locally, so that we've got a more less kind of biased view about what domestic abuse means. We've moved on in 10 years. You're absolutely right. Legislation does change, but I think attitudes they're tougher to shift. There's historic stigma attached to our community. There's historic notions around disability. There are historic notions around, this. Remember when we used to have those little things outside a chemist, which used to put money into, That's how people thought about that community. We're in the same position. We need to be on a level playing field with the rest of society, and we can't continue to be looked at in the way that disabled people once were. We're a huge resource. We've got so much going on. We need to invest in our community, and we need to see people like yourself, myself, and other people being able to represent our community to the best that we can, to support younger activists, younger advocates, you know, many of whom I work with and are in your book. So that's my new mission. That's really what I'm about. I would like to think that my own personal story will maybe open up people's ideas around children's rights in domestic abuse settings. We cannot leave, you know, we cannot allow gender bias or any other kind of bias to prevent us from talking directly and listening directly to children. And that is what the UN Convention, you know, says, you know, that we should be listening to children. That's what we said in NAPIC in the 1980s, you know, that no decision should be made without the direct involvement of a child, you know, and that has shifted. So in many degrees, that historically, sadly, has moved away from where it should be. You know, we should be actioning, they should be actioning, children should be actioning. Participation doesn't just mean listening, it means allowing that person to take some form of action, you know, their own pathway to improve their situation. In domestic abuse situations, slowly, they've just acknowledged that children can be domestic abuse victims. We need much better work within family courts, within CAFCAS. So I think there's a lot to learn from my own personal story in that. And that's why I kind of shared it with you. I'm really concerned that children should be alienated or separated unfairly, not just within the care system, but within our family courts.
Listen, Sean, I love speaking to you. I love getting your take on everything. Everyone's going to be really excited about reading your piece now. And you've just spoken so much there and so passionately about some of the things that I really care about, especially reducing stigma, especially stories and how we hold our stories and how we share our stories and the ways that we do that. So thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate you coming on today. And here's to everyone getting a hold of your chapter.
Well, here's to you and what you're doing. And I'm honoured to be in the third instalment. I really appreciate it. And, you know, what we do as, you know, as fellow care experienced people, that says a lot about us and our belief in our own community. So good on you. Thank you.